Before you were born, armpit odor had no commercial category. It was not a crisis to be solved by a product on a shelf. It was just a fact of being near other people in warm weather. That sounds obvious, but it matters enormously for what came next. Sweat itself has almost no smell when it leaves the body. The odor comes from bacteria breaking down proteins in that moisture. That process takes time, which means smell is partly a question of frequency. How often you bathed, how often your clothes were changed and aired out. For most of the 19th century, even among the middle classes, that interval was long. Weekly baths were considered reasonable, sometimes even generous, depending on your household's access to water. Most people carried some degree of body odor most of the time. And because most people did, the social pressure around it was minimal by comparison. The problem was not smell, exactly. It was who was expected to smell how. Working bodies were understood to be physical. They sweated. That was the job. But as cities grew denser and office work expanded in the late 1800s, a new kind of proximity arrived. Strangers now shared carriages, offices, counters, and waiting rooms for hours at a time. Smell moved from the domestic to the public, which changed what it meant. Perfume had been part of upper-class European life for centuries, and it did real masking work. But it was expensive, heavily scented, and did nothing for the actual source of the problem. You could smell of roses on top of something else entirely, and everyone nearby knew it. What emerged in the last decade of the 1800s was something different in concept. Not masking, but blocking. Addressing the mechanism, not just the output. The first product specifically marketed for underarm odor appeared in 1888. It was called Mum, a cream sold in a small jar, applied by hand. It worked partly by creating a mild antimicrobial barrier on the skin's surface. It didn't stop sweating, it slowed the bacterial process that created the odor. The technology was modest, the packaging was plain, and it didn't sell explosively at first, because the problem it claimed to solve wasn't widely acknowledged as a product-sized problem yet. That distinction is worth sitting with for a moment. There is a difference between a problem that exists and a problem that has been named and monetized. Odor existed, but underarm odor as a personal failing requiring a commercial fix didn't exist yet. That had to be built, not by scientists, but by marketing copy. Edna Murphy, a young entrepreneur, began selling Odorono, an aluminum chloride antiperspirant, around 1910. It was a different class of product from Mum. It actually stopped perspiration. Aluminum chloride works by temporarily blocking sweat ducts in the skin. It was effective, but it had problems. It stained clothes. It irritated sensitive skin. And its early marketing was cautious because the product required admitting something uncomfortable. That you sweated, that this sweating had an audience, that others might notice. In 1919, Odorono ran a now famous advertisement in Ladies' Home Journal. It addressed a woman discovering why a man she liked had stopped calling. The cause, the ad implied, was her underarm odor, which she hadn't even known was a problem. The magazine received hundreds of complaints from readers who found the copy deeply offensive, but the ad also generated a large increase in sales. That outcome was instructive to the whole industry. Shame, it turned out, moved product. Not just information, not just convenience, shame. The campaign didn't invent anxiety about smell, but it attached specific social consequences to it. For roughly 2 decades after Odorono, the market was almost entirely aimed at women. Men's sweat was not being sold back to men as a problem requiring a solution. There was a cultural logic to this, even if it wasn't flattering to anyone involved. Physical labor and masculine exertion had long been coded as normal, even respectable. A man who sweated at his desk wasn't failing, he was working. Or so the assumption ran. But that assumption had a class ceiling on it that was already cracking. By the 1930s and 40s, the white-collar workplace was expanding and becoming more competitive. The idea that appearance, grooming, and presentation were professional tools started gaining real traction. Men's deodorant products existed, but they were quiet about it, understated, almost apologetic in their shelving. Then the post-war period changed the conditions again, fairly quickly. Suburban housing, car commutes, synthetic fabrics, and central heating all changed how bodies behaved across a day. Synthetic fibers, like nylon and early polyester, trapped heat and moisture differently than cotton or wool. You could sweat more, retain it longer, and produce more bacterial activity against your skin. The same office that once had windows and ceiling fans now had sealed climate systems. Controlled temperature sounds like comfort, but it also meant no natural air movement to help things along. The product category was now solving a problem that modern life was actively making worse. By the 1950s, men's deodorant advertising became noticeably more direct. not shaming in quite the same way as the women's campaigns, but practical, functional, almost clinical. The message was less, "You have a problem you don't know about," and more, "Serious men handle this," which is a different rhetorical path to the same bathroom shelf. Meanwhile, the formats were still fairly inconvenient by modern standards. Creams in jars required fingers. Roll-ons, introduced in the mid-1950s, borrowed directly from ballpoint pen technology. A ball bearing sitting in a reservoir of liquid rolling product on the skin. Simple and genuinely effective. But roll-ons were wet. They needed drying time before dressing, which annoyed people in morning routines. The aerosol can arrive as a format and changed the application experience entirely. Spray deodorants became enormously popular through the 1960s and into the 1970s. They were fast, dry on contact, required no touching, and felt vaguely modern and hygienic in a post-war sense. At their peak, aerosols represented the majority of the deodorant market in several Western countries. Then the science arrived in two directions at once, and the category got complicated. In the mid-1970s, research confirmed that chlorofluorocarbons used as aerosol propellants were damaging the ozone layer. Regulatory pressure and consumer backlash followed. Aerosol deodorant sales dropped significantly in a fairly short window. The industry reformulated propellants and eventually recovered some of that ground, but the format never fully dominated again. Simultaneously, a different kind of concern was emerging about the active ingredient in antiperspirants. Aluminum compounds, which had been the functional core of sweat-blocking products since Odorono, came under scrutiny. Early and widely circulated claims suggested a link between aluminum absorption and Alzheimer's disease. Later, similar concerns were raised around a possible connection to breast cancer. Both claims were amplified significantly beyond what the underlying evidence actually supported. Major health organizations, including the National Cancer Institute, found no established causal link. But the claims spread faster than the corrections, as claims usually do. This created a durable market split that still exists today in any pharmacy aisle. Deodorant on one side, antiperspirant on the other. Same shelf, different mechanisms, very different reputations. Deodorant addresses odor through antimicrobial ingredients or odor-neutralizing compounds without blocking sweat. Antiperspirant blocks perspiration at the duct using aluminum-based compounds and typically includes deodorant function as well. The distinction matters medically to almost nobody, but it matters enormously to branding and consumer identity. Aluminum-free became a product claim, a label feature, and eventually a premium price point. The irony is that sweating is a genuinely useful physiological process. The body regulates temperature through it. Blocking sweat in the underarm region, which represents a small fraction of the body's total sweat output, has minimal thermal effect. But the aluminum-free market wasn't really about thermal regulation, it was about perceived naturalness. And perceived naturalness, by the 2000s and 2010s, was worth significant money on a product label. The stick format, introduced in the 1960s and refined over decades, became the dominant delivery system in North America. Firm, dry, easy to apply, minimal mess, and shelf-stable for long periods in retail and in the bathroom cabinet. Europe and much of the rest of the world leaned more toward roll-ons and sprays, a preference split that persists. Why the difference? Partly early market habits that locked in before alternatives were widely available. Partly retail shelf design, packaging economics, and the way bathroom routines become fixed in adolescence and stay fixed. The natural deodorant market didn't arrive quietly, it arrived with packaging that announced its intentions. Clean typography, minimal ingredients lists, words like gentle, plant-based, and microbiome-friendly. That last term points to something genuinely interesting underneath the marketing language. The skin, including underarm skin, hosts a community of microorganisms that are not all equally responsible for odor. Some bacterial strains produce significantly more odorous compounds than others when they break down sweat proteins. Research into selectively reducing the odor-producing strains while leaving others intact is a real area of study. Whether most commercial natural products meaningfully achieve this is a more complicated question. Many rely on baking soda, which raises skin pH and creates a less hospitable environment for odor-causing bacteria. Effective for some people, genuinely irritating for others, particularly those with sensitive skin. The category grew because a portion of consumers decided the old formula's trade-offs were no longer acceptable to them. Not necessarily because the science demanded it, but because the cultural moment made it feel necessary. That pattern, cultural pressure reshaping a product faster than evidence does, appears repeatedly in this category's history. The 19 Shane campaign, the 1970s ozone panic, the aluminum health scare, the natural movement. Each wave reshaped purchasing behavior and product development significantly, regardless of whether the underlying concern was proportionate. This is not cynicism. People's concerns about what they put on their bodies are reasonable and worth taking seriously, but it does reveal how much of the deodorant market runs on anxiety as much as it runs on chemistry. The actual odor problem being solved has not fundamentally changed since the 1880s. Bacteria, sweat, protein breakdown, heat, time. The mechanisms available to address it, antimicrobial action, pH adjustment, duct blocking, fragrance, are also well established. What keeps changing is the cultural frame around which mechanism feels acceptable and to whom. Meanwhile, the physical form of the products has been remarkably stable for decades. The twist-up stick mechanism used in most solid deodorants today would be recognizable to someone from the 1970s. The roll-on ball has barely changed since it borrowed its design from a pen in 1955. The aerosol valve mechanism is a mature technology that has not required reinvention. This is partly a sign that the formats work well enough, partly a sign of how hard it is to improve on simple, and partly a sign that the bathroom routine itself has calcified around these objects. You reach for the same format you started using as a teenager, probably the same brand your household used. Switching formats feels slightly strange. Switching brands is moderately disruptive. Not using one at all is now socially loaded. That last point is worth noting. The product created a norm that made its own absence conspicuous. Before commercial deodorant, not using deodorant was simply the default. After a century of advertising, workplace expectations, and social conditioning, not using it requires explanation. The norm flipped completely, and it flipped faster than a generation. By the time the baby boom grew up, deodorant use was effectively compulsory in most Western workplace and social settings. That's a substantial cultural shift delivered through a product that costs a few dollars and lasts a few weeks. The economics of the category are also worth understanding briefly. Deodorant is a high-frequency repurchase item with strong brand loyalty and very low switching motivation. You buy it roughly every 3 to 6 weeks, you barely notice the cost individually, and you rarely compare options carefully. That combination makes it extraordinarily valuable to consumer goods companies, without requiring dramatic innovation. Procter & Gamble, Unilever, and a handful of other multinationals have controlled most of the market for decades. New entrants succeed primarily by targeting the values-driven segment, aluminum-free, sustainable packaging, refillable formats, not by offering a meaningfully different solution to the underlying biochemical problem. The refillable deodorant, which has gained attention as a sustainability pitch, is genuinely a reasonable packaging idea. It's also, if you think about it, closer to what Mum was in 1888, a jar you refill from a larger supply. The category spent a century building elaborate single-use delivery systems and is now partially walking that back. As with most things in this space, some details and timelines vary depending on the source you consult. Market histories, patent records, and advertising archives don't always agree on exact dates or first-mover claims. What is consistent is the broader shape, a real hygiene function, amplified by manufactured social anxiety, stabilized by habit. Deodorant doesn't solve a medical crisis. It addresses a biological reality that became a commercial opportunity. The smell was always there. What changed was who decided it was your problem to fix, and how urgently.